Okay, so you see the recording button. Recording has started, Tanay, so you can start.
Yep. Yeah. Yeah. So thanks for inviting me to present our recent work. So I'm going to be talking about an upcoming paper which is with Ayan, Alex, and Hariram. I'm not sure if Hariram is here right now, but yeah. So I will mainly be elaborating on each of these words in my title. So I'll start by explaining what I mean by NADS2. Then I'll tell you about our construction, which is a lattice model of these NADS2 geometries. And then I'll move on to describe how our model actually replicates some information processing properties of black holes, namely this information mirroring. Uh, yeah. So this is the outline of my talk. So I'll start with a brief motivation and introduction. Then I'll move on to introducing the NADS2s. Then define our chain model or lattice model, and then come to these black hole information processing issues. And finally, I'll conclude with some possible future work. Yeah, so let's start by defining what do we mean by an old black hole. So if we plot the entanglement entropy of the Hawking radiation versus time, the curve we get is called the Page curve. So this guy is plotted here. So we assume that the black hole initially starts in a pure state, a pure unentangled state. And as it slowly radiates, we expect the entanglement entropy of the radiation to grow. But eventually, once all the radiation is gone, we expect the final state to also be pure and unentangled. So we expect the final entropy to also be zero. So there should be a transition point in between where the entropy of the radiation starts to decrease, which is this guy.
Tanay, I have one thing.
Yeah.
Hello.
Yeah.
When you say this entanglement of a Hawking radiation, so what qubit system means? What is the dimension of the system and other things? How do I view it as an entangled? What is it?
Yeah. So we assume it's a bipartite system where one part is the black hole interior and the other part is the radiation.
So what is the Hilbert space dimension?
It will scale exponentially with the entropy.
With the
entropy, e raised to s, right?
No. Hilbert space dimension. If it is a bipartite state,
Yeah.
is it what is the dimension of the each Hilbert space? Is
Yeah,
it
yeah.
like qubit or something like dimension is what is the dimension?
Yeah, I'm saying that it will scale with the entropy of the black hole, right? At some particular time.
It scales with the entropy of the black hole.
Yeah, so it's exponential in the entropy.
Means the dimension changes with the entropy of a black hole.
Yeah.
No, actually, I think what he means, sorry, maybe I can just interject. I think what he means is that the size of the system scales in some way with the size of the black hole, and the entropy itself scales with the area of the black hole.
Yeah.
So the effective system dimension is.
Hello?
Yeah. Go on.
Prabha, it's cut.
I was just saying that the effective system dimension, in some sense, changes as the black hole is evaporating. The effective system dimension is changing with respect to the size of the black hole, right?
So they calculate the entanglement entropy along with the change in the effective dimension. That's what that's what the plot is about.
This is the plot is the entanglement entropy of the radiation subsystem. So yeah, we are assuming that we have a bipartite system where one part is it's the interior of the black hole and the other part is the Hawking radiation. And yeah, what I'm plotting here is just the entanglement entropy of the Hawking radiation. So yeah, rho log rho of the Hawking radiation. I can't hear you.
No. I am not saying anything.
Okay.
Just trying to understand it.
I mean, this is a dynamical system. Then I don't think you're sitting, and it's a quantum field theory in some sense. So the dimension is infinite, if you wish. But if you want to associate some number, it's e power s.
Yeah.
I mean, that's
how do I basically how do I calculate the entanglement entropy if the effective dimensions are increasing? For example, if I begin with
you can use the fact that there is Hawking radiation, so there's a temperature associated with it. So one writes, if you wish, an approximation which is this doubled thermal state or thermofield double. And so that's for a non-decaying black hole. Okay. So I think you should just proceed.
Yeah, I just want to make a comment is simply that here the total dimension is fixed because it's the dimension of the black hole interior and the Hawking radiation. That dimension, the total dimension of the system is fixed.
Okay.
But if you assume that the system reaches a typicality, the system is a typical state, the black hole interior is a typical state, and the evolution is unitary, given by unitary evolution is given by a unitary operator, then you could argue that the entropy of the radiation can be maximum only when half of the radiation has come out of the black hole, and then it has to decay, right? There's something Page's theorem which ensures this.
That fixed means the compound system, that means radiation plus black hole, that the dimension of the compound system is fixed. So is there any number for that dimension, or can it
that
be
is
any...
something Tanay already answered, right? It is
that's e raised to s. It scales with the entropy of the black hole.
Okay.
Okay, maybe we can move ahead.
So as I was saying, eventually we expect there will be a point of time where the entropy in the radiation will start to decrease. So this is the transition point where entropy starts to decrease is called the Page time. And we expect that after the Page time, the information inside the black hole, the information about its formation and so on, will be slowly start to reveal in the Hawking radiation. Now, if you do a back of the envelope calculation for the Page time for a black hole with the mass of our sun, the Page time is of the order of 10 raised to 67. So it's an immensely large number. The age of the universe is 14 billion years. So such black holes haven't reached the Page time yet. So this is just to give you a sense of scale. Yeah, now I'll come to this famous Hayden-Preskill protocol. So the question they ask is, if you, after this Page time, after we have such an old black hole, if we throw in some qubits inside the black hole, how quickly do they come out in the Hawking radiation, or can they even come out in the Hawking radiation? So they assume that the internal dynamics of the black hole is unitary, and it mixes up the qubits that you throw in and the qubits already inside the black hole very quickly. One of their main results or their arguments is that qubits which are thrown in after the Page time are very quickly revealed in the Hawking radiation.
So what do we mean by throwing the qubit?
You can imagine it's some spin system or something like that Alice throws it into the black hole.
Yeah, that's what. What do I mean by throwing? What is the how do I do that mathematically?
Mathematically, it's just some matter particle which you throw in the geometry along some geodesic. So it will just fall in the matter following a geodesic. Fall inside the black hole following some geodesic. So it's just some matter you're throwing in.
Okay.
And by information, I encode the information inside the matter I'm throwing. So one of the main results is that the qubits that you throw in after the Page time are very quickly revealed in the Hawking radiation. And the time it takes for the qubits that you throw in to be revealed is what is known as the Hayden-Preskill time. So which scales as this line here, which is RS log RS, where RS is the Schwarzschild radius of the black hole. Now this circuit is a representation of the Hayden-Preskill protocol.
Tanay, just one quick question. This RS log RS, this is also the scrambling time, or?
Yes, exactly. It's the scrambling.
Yeah, okay. Thanks.
So, Tanay?
Yeah.
So what happens if you throw in a qubit in a pure state?
The qubits in pure states also are revealed after the Hayden-Preskill time in the Hawking radiation.
I see. And what about qubits in a maximally mixed state?
So they consider some random density matrix and then they purify it in their paper, and then they throw in the purified state.
I see.
Yeah. So the protocol works for both cases. Any arbitrary a pure state or also such a density matrix.
Okay, just one comment. So this RS is the time of is a Schwarzschild radius at the time of infall. So when the qubit actually falls inside the horizon. So this is RS is the Schwarzschild radius at that time.
Yeah, so as I was saying, the protocol can be described using the circuit diagram. So psi A, get psi A is the qubits that Alice is throwing inside the black hole. This line BH indicates the qubits that are already inside the black hole. This beta indicates that the stuff inside the black hole is maximally entangled with the radiation that has already happened, which is referred to as the early radiation. Now these two are maximally entangled and Alice is throwing in some state psi. Now this unitary U it represents the internal dynamics of the black hole, which is assumed to be unitary, as I said before. So this mixes up the black hole qubits with Alice's qubits rather quickly. And some part of that is thrown out in the late radiation, which is given by this guy. And the other is still retained inside the black hole. So now what Bob can do is he constructs this decoding unitary V, and he applies that to this early radiation, which he's collected already, and this late radiation, which he now collects. And their claim is that using this decoding unitary, Bob can recover the initial state that Alice had thrown in. Yeah, now this whole protocol, they restate in terms of a quantum erasure channel. So let's assume that, Alice is throwing in k qubits, and Alice's qubits plus the black hole qubits add up to n. So now how is this related to an erasure channel? So from the point of view of Bob, the qubits that are retained inside the black hole are essentially erased. So he has no access to them. They're behind the black hole horizon. So the statement they make is that random unitary encodings achieve the rate k by n for the quantum erasure channel. And where is this random unitary encodings coming from? So this unitary dynamics of the black hole, this unitary is picked at random with respect to the Haar measure, but they claim that you can pick it with respect to some other measure and the protocol will just work.
By other measure, what do you mean?
Yeah, I'm not really sure.
I see.
Yeah.
Like
They
when
say,
let's say it's not like uniformly random over.
It's not uniformly random. Yeah, some other probability distribution. Yeah. But
I see. Okay.
But there's no proof for that. They just state that it should work.
I see.
Yeah. So let's look at some paradoxes which can arise or which can be addressed using this protocol. So what happens if, let's say, Alice jumps inside the black hole along with her qubit? So then after she jumps in, the Hawking radiation leaks out and it contains information about her qubit. Then Bob does the decoding. So now he also carries a copy of Alice's qubit. And he also jumps inside the black hole. Now, once both of them are inside the black hole, can they talk to each other and verify that both of them share a copy of the same state? So can they verify that some cloning has occurred? Now, as you already know, the linearity and unitarity of quantum mechanics would prohibit any cloning from occurring. So the way this can be avoided is if it takes Bob a very long time to decode the Hawking radiation which has come out. Now, this was argued in a paper by Hayden and Harlow. So they argue that even if you employ the most efficient decoding operators you can think of, Bob will take an exponential time in the entropy of the black hole to decode the Hawking radiation. Now, the evaporation time of the black hole scales polynomially with the entropy at the page time. So it takes a very long time for Bob to decode. By the time the black hole would have evaporated already. So this experiment where Bob and Alice would try to verify cloning is not even in principle possible. Similarly, some other paradoxes such as the EMPS paradox and so on, their experiments cannot even be realized physically if Bob takes an exponential time to decode the radiation. So this protocol would help us address many of these paradoxes which have come up in net research. So yeah, now
just one thing which I missed. Why do the random unitary is required at the U in the protocol? Why
Here?
do you? Oh, yeah.
From
Why are you choosing
from
random unitaries?
Because you don't really know what the dynamics of the hole are. So yeah, it's a model that, like, it's a guess they are making. It's a model for a black hole that they've constructed. So
Is it
since you don't really know what the
is it this like very Shannon kind of argument that the random unitary would do just as well or something like that?
no, so the argument is that if you would expect that if it's a random unitary, then the information should be, like, scrambled up completely. So they're trying to consider a worst case kind of situation. But it turns out that considering this random unitaries actually helps because they achieve this this rate for the erasure channel. Does that answer the question?
Yeah.
I just have one more question. I mean, your talk is very interesting. So sorry for all these stupid questions. But I had a question that the timescales you are talking about, this is an average time scale you average over, an ensemble of qubits you will throw in a black hole, or this is a sort of a typical time scale for any qubit you're going to throw in? I mean, is there a chance that you will be able to recover some information before the time scale you're talking about?
So your voice is breaking up. I couldn't hear the question.
Okay, never mind. I'll speak to you offline. Please continue.
Okay.
I can just yeah. So I think just to, so what he means is that for any number of qubits, it will take a very long time for Bob to decode and then compare his note with Alice. So even if it's 1 qubit or 10 qubits, I think it won't matter because the timescales will be such that they will not be able to meet. So it's like this, if you recall the Penrose diagram, the Alice will have to send the information earlier and earlier for Bob to, I mean, if Bob takes very long to jump into the black hole, Alice will have to send inside the black hole the information earlier and earlier. So so from what I understand, it's not about number of qubits in comparing the timescales.
I think Vaibhav's question was more to do with whether the time scale is
exactly
an average time scale or it is a typical time scale.
Exactly. Is it a statistical result in the sense of an average over ensemble, or it's like for any qubit you throw in?
I think the answer is
yeah,
typical.
I think
Okay, thank you.
Hello.
Yeah.
Tanay, sorry for again.
It's okay.
If you use a random unitary, what is the structure of V? That means the decoding unitary.
Yeah. So that's a good question. So the decoding unitary would, of course, depend on the unitary you're using for the encoding. So in the Hayden-Preskill paper, they don't actually talk about how they would do the decoding. So this was addressed in a follow-up paper by Kitaev and some others. So they say, sorry?
Yoshida and
Kitaev and Yoshida, yeah. So in the Hayden-Preskill paper itself, they don't talk about how we would depend on you, but we does depend on you. So in Kitaev's paper, I don't remember the details exactly, but they use the Grover search algorithm in some way to construct V given some n qubit U.
Means if they are just looking for maximally entanglement, means there unitary U, which requires to be some kind of chaotic. What random unitaries are doing, is that the requirement they wanted to use the random unitaries there?
Yeah, they want.
You explained it. I'm just want.
Yeah, that's true. You want a black hole to be a fast scrambler, and we want the information to be mixed up completely. So the thinking was that if we use random unitaries, that would work. Yeah.
Perfect. Thank
you. So now after this introduction to these information processing ideas of the black hole, what we are trying to look at are these two main ideas. So one of them is information mirroring, and the other is scrambling by a black hole. So now where does this information mirroring come from? So by information mirror, I mean the qubits that Alice throws in after the page time are revealed very quickly, as argued by Hayden and Preskill. But if Alice throws in qubits before the page time, she has to wait until the page time is achieved and only then the information leaks out. So that's what Hayden and Preskill mean by saying black holes are quantum information mirrors. So yeah, no, we take inspiration from this idea of fragmentation of near horizon geometry of near extremal black holes. So we expect.
Hello.
Yeah.
Sorry.
Yeah,
Why
ahead.
mirror? Why mirror? Can you? I didn't get. Mirror.
It's like you imagine throwing a ball at a wall and the ball gets instantly reflected back.
Okay.
It's that kind of a picture. Yeah.
Okay. Thanks.
Yeah, so what we're trying to do is understand these ideas of information mirroring. So we want to construct a model of a black hole horizon. To do that, we take inspiration from this idea of fragmentation, which was described in this paper by Maldacena and others. So they argue that the near horizon geometry of near extremal black holes would break up into multiple ADS2 geometries. And when two of these ADS2 throats come close to each other, we expect that a large number of low energy gapless states would appear. These gapless states are what we'll call hair in what follows. So this is the picture, or cartoony picture of fragmentation. So you start with one throat and it fragments into two ADS2 throats labeled by Q1 and Q2. So yeah, this is the schematic picture of the model we've constructed. So the picture is just a two-dimensional example, but the dimensionality of the lattice will be the same as the dimensionality of the black hole horizon we want to model. So there are two main ingredients in our model. One of them is this ADS2 black hole given by these drum-like objects. And the second is this violet hair-like objects, which are inspired by this low energy states which come up in fragmentation. So we call these hair gravitational charges. So now in what follows, I'll describe each of these two ingredients in significant detail. So yeah, let's start by introducing NADS2. So the first question I get is, what does N stand for? It stands for nearly ADS2. And we'll see why this is nearly ADS2 and not exactly ADS2. Yeah, so we start with the action for JT gravity. As phi here is the dilaton and U is what we call the boundary time. You can solve for the equation of motion for the dilaton, and it's easy to see that that implies that the metric is always locally ADS2. You can also trivially see that the dilaton does not couple to the matter at all. So what we do is we impose a boundary condition on the dilaton, which is given in this line. So the dilaton at the boundary is phi r bar by epsilon, where we set phi r bar to some constant, and epsilon is a cutoff length. Yeah, so this is a picture. The picture on the left is the full ADS2 geometry. The picture on the right is a cutout of the ADS2 geometry, and this red curve is a cutoff trajectory. This trajectory is labeled by T of U, rho of U. Now we'll see how we can interpret T of U as the mass of a black hole in ADS2 in the following discussion. So to do that, we want to consider T of U as a boundary limit of some bulk diffeomorphism, a bulk coordinate transformation. Now the action is SL2R invariant. So the only physically distinct solutions will be in this diffeomorphism mod SL2R coset. Now this identification of T with the bulk diffeomorphism is not unique. So we need to do some gauge fixing. So we choose the Eddington-Finkelstein gauge, where the ADS2 metric looks like this guy. So this is the metric for a black hole with a time dependent mass mu given by 1 by rs squared. Where kappa is a parameter of our model, and I'll just set it to 1 in what follows. Now we want to relate this time-dependent mass of a ADS2 black hole with this cutoff trajectory to do this coordinate transformation. Now this transformation takes us from the black hole metric to this metric, assuming 1 by rs square is equal to -2 times Schwarzian of T of U, where this is the Schwarzian derivative of T with respect to U. And recall that 1 by rs square is essentially the mass of the ADS2 black hole. So we've seen how we can interpret this cutoff trajectory T as the mass of a EDH2 black hole. Now, as I said before, the action is SL2R invariant. So let's see what the SL2R charges look like in terms of this cutoff trajectory. To do that, we define the thermal time tau, which is related to this cutoff trajectory Tu by this tan hyperbolic function. So you can see if you transform tau to I tau and T to IT, tau will get a periodicity of beta. Now the SL2R charges of the NADH2 throats are labeled by these curly looking Qs, and they have three components labeled by 0, plus and minus. And they're related to tau and hence T's by these three equations. So you can see that the three charges are related to the three derivatives of tau, tau prime, tau double prime, and tau triple prime. Now these relations can be inverted so that you can relate tau prime, tau double prime, and tau triple prime to these three charges. Excuse me. Yeah, so the SL2R charges which I showed in the previous slides, they can be thought of as maps from this boundary time U to T of U and therefore also to tau of U. Now to make the map unique, we need to impose some initial conditions. We just choose this initial condition. You can choose a different one. You can set this constant to be something else if you like. Use which is a SL2R invariant dot product of two charge vectors. So these two charge vectors are bold A's and bold B's. So these are each three component objects, and their dot product is defined in this line. So using the relations I showed in the previous slides for these Q's, it's easy to check that Q dot Q is -2 times Schwarzschild of T. And recall that -2 times Schwarzschild of T was proportional to the mass of the EDH2 black hole. Now another identity or another relation to keep in mind is that these time derivatives, so these primes indicate a derivative with respect to U. So these derivatives of these SL2R charges are proportional to the derivatives of the Schwarzschilds. That is, they are proportional to the derivatives of the masses. So if the EDH2 mass is time independent, that means these SL2R charges are also time independent. So yeah, I've described this big story of NADH2. What is the moral of this whole thing? The main thing you need to remember, which would be useful for the discussion which will follow, is that each ADH2 throat has these three SL2R charges, which I label by these curly Qs. And these represent a ADH2 black hole with a time dependent mass given by M of U, which is equal to Q dot Q. So this is the main result from this section, which you need to remember. And if you didn't follow the details, it's still okay.
May I ask a question, please?
Yeah.
So it appears to me that instead of calling it a mass, perhaps it should be called a stress tensor, because in the Pfefferman-Graham gauge, instead of Eddington-Finkelstein, it will appear like the normalizable mode of the metric.
Yeah.
And it will have exactly the same role in higher dimensions, which in higher dimensions is played by the stress tensor. Like for example, in asymptotical ADS3, if you write it in the Barnados form, which is the Pfefferman-Graham gauge, then this guy will be like T++ and T will be Schwarzian of the analytic and ideal analytic conformal transformations.
Yeah.
So I think that I'm agreeing with this identification that it has something to do with energy.
Okay.
But I wouldn't call it mass. I would call it rather the stress tensor. Is there any particular reason you are calling it a mass? Do you have the Vaidya metric kind of thing in mind?
No, I'm not really sure. Yeah, it is true that in the Pfefferman-Graham coordinate, the Schwarzschild will appear in this the energy momentum tensor. That's true.
But Tanay, the metric that you wrote down is sort of a Vaidya metric, right? I mean,
this RU guy.
Yes. Yeah, Gautam, would you call this a Vaidya type metric?
I was wondering, yeah, perhaps. I mean, it's Eddington-Finkelstein after all. It is a little like Vaidya metric. Yeah, is that? I mean, why are you calling this a mass? That's my question. Is there some? Yeah.
Because if you because we can actually use this prescription of Polchinski and others to call it, actually then you can show it is the ADM mass actually. I think that there is a general prescription in NADS2, holographic normalization prescription, which identifies, if you follow that, then essentially it is proportional to the Schwarzian, and M of U is the Schwarzian, and this is what they call the mass essentially, the ADM mass, whatever.
So that is what I would call the stress tensor. This is, yeah, I see what you mean. I mean, this is the same as Balasubramaniam et al.'s the holographic stress tensor calculation, and
yes,
you may call it an ADM mass, but actually, this is asymptotically ADS. So presumably, the holographic stress tensor is the best thing that you can do, short of getting the ADM mass and so on. Anyway, I mean, it's going way out of the main theme, so we can. I was just curious about. Okay. I got what you're saying, Ayan.
Yeah. So this is one last ingredient I haven't talked about yet. Well, the first one was these NADS2 geometries. Excuse me. The second one is these gravitational Hare charges, which I showed in these violet squiggly lines. So these are labeled by these squarish looking bold Qs, and these obey the Klein-Gordon equation. So the discrete version of the Klein-Gordon equation given by this guy, where sigma is again a parameter of our model. So now the next step is to couple these gravitational Hare to our NADS2 throats. So which is what is the contents of this section. So yeah, again I flashed this picture. Our model is a lattice of these ADS2 geometries with some gravitational Hare on top, and now we want to see how we can make these two guys interact. So we want the coupling to obey these three requirements. So we want that the full dynamic should have only one SL2R symmetry and not SL2R tensored in. So this single SL2R that is preserved would correspond to the isometry of the unfragmented near horizon geometry. We of course want causality to hold. By that I mean, if we throw in some matter in this site, let's say, we don't want the charges at the nearest neighbors or the faraway sites to jump instantaneously. We want there to be some propagation speed, which will carry this signal along our lattice. And finally, of course, we want that the model should have an overall conserved energy. Now, these three constraints are not enough to uniquely determine the kind of coupling we should use. So we are guided by phenomenology. Our model is not derived from anywhere. We are guided by phenomenology in what follows. So yeah, these are the equations for a model. So these are the equations for a lattice with periodic boundary conditions, for a chain model with periodic boundary conditions. So it's a one-dimensional chain with periodic boundaries. So recall that these MIs are the masses of these ADS2 throats, the black holes in these ADS2 throats. This lambda is some coupling parameter, which I'll talk about in detail in what follows. These squarish Qs are the gravitational Hare charges, and these squiggly Qs are the SL2R charges of the ADS2 throats. Now recall that the gravitational Hare charges obeyed this free Klein-Gordon, discrete Klein-Gordon equation. So we add an additional term which couples the Hare charges to the SL2R charges of the ADS2s.
Sorry, can you explain this gravitational Hare charges? Maybe you said it before, but I missed it. What exactly are these?
Yeah. So this we are taking inspiration from this idea of fragmentation that Marla Sena talked about.
Yeah.
So when a near horizon geometry will fragment into multiple ADS2 throats,
yes.
And when these two guys come very close to each other, we expect there'll be a large number of low energy excitations. And these guys are what we're calling these gravitational hair.
But they're represented by what? Matter fields coupled to JT gravity, or what? What are they represented by?
In a model?
Yeah.
Right now they're just represented by this Klein-Gordon. So, yeah.
Oh, sorry, I missed.
Yeah, a discrete version because it's a lattice of ADS2s.
Where this I is which ADS throat it is.
Yeah, exactly.
Round.
Yeah.
Sorry, how did you get this Klein-Gordon equation? Sorry, I understand.
Yeah. Sorry, what was the question?
So, can you explain this Klein-Gordon equation? I missed this part. How did you get it?
How did we get this line? Yeah, so as I said, we're not deriving our model from anywhere. So we just, we're assuming that these gravitational hair charges will follow these equations. So it's not, we're not deriving these from fragmentation exactly.
Derivation, I mean, that's fine, but some intuition, can you give us some intuition about how, sorry, let me understand. This double prime is with respect to what?
U. The boundary time U, yeah.
Okay, and minus 1 upon sigma square. What is sigma?
Sigma is a coupling parameter in our model.
Where did it appear in your action? I forgot.
It's not appearing in the action. The action was just for a single ADS2 throat.
Let me try to understand. So do you have in mind, let's say, some picture like these are all near extremal black holes in some asymptotically ADS4 or maybe asymptotically flat or some higher dimensional stuff, and these correspond to the gravitational hair corresponds to.
No, so actually these Roman cues are simply mobile hair that lives in the throat. I mean in the asymptotic throat actually, which is what usually I think there are some particular names for this, and it's inspired from this kind of a picture that if you so when the instanton moduli space where for fragmentation, this Brill instanton moduli space, they have some kind of divergences when the center of the throats come close together. So at that point you will have a lot of low energy states, and they are mobile and they live in the throat of the geometry. So this is kind of simply inspired from that. It's just put in by hand. I mean, just to see what happens. And there's
some new dynamical degrees of freedom, which are presumably represented by matter fields coupled to, I mean, I'm just trying to get
these are pure gravity modes. These are pure gravity modes. If you think they're pure higher dimensional gravity modes, which are mobile on the lattice. So these are SL2R charges. So you can think of them as really as, and that what is it called, the gravitational hair charges or something like that. Yeah, something of that order. I mean, we don't have a very kind of a physical picture yet for these things. It's just kind of put in by hand because you need somehow the ADS2 throats to talk to each other, and they need something mobile, and you just put some kind of
I mean, there are at least two ways of thinking about it. Like if you take this Maldacena et al.'s model of this four-dimensional magnetic black holes, which two ADS2 throats, and you have then there are additional degrees of freedom which comes from the four-dimensional description. That's one. Then the other one is the Stanford-Schenker-Saad description, in which you have JT model itself, and you have a large number of asymptotic, I mean the ADS2 boundaries, and you have geometries connecting them. Not in a lattice way as you are doing here, but lots of them connected by wormholes and baby universes and whatnot. So that could be one model. And the third thing is what you were saying, which maybe it's all there somehow there in the fragmentation paper. I have forgotten this part. Okay. Anyway, please carry on. Yeah, I would like to.
Yeah, thanks for the comments actually. So it is more to do with, I think, this higher dimensional picture for as of now, but I think picture also later in his talk.
Okay, all right. Please carry on.
Yeah.
Tanay, one question. So this sigma appears in the coupling as 1 over sigma square.
Yeah.
And you were saying that these Roman cues live naturally in the fragmented NADS2 throats in somewhere in between them maybe. So in this lattice picture that you showed, is there, can we see this sigma as some measure or notion of length in that lattice?
Yeah. So if you want to take a continuum limit, we'll have to scale sigma with the number of sites. Let's say we are in a chain model. So sigma would be proportional to the length of the chain in some sense. Yeah. So if you want to take a continuum limit, you need to scale sigma with the, as you keep adding more and more sites to your chain.
Okay. Okay.
Yeah. So I was here. Yeah. So yeah, as I was saying, if we have these two equations, then it's easy to check that something which is defined as epsilon in this line. So it's easy to check that epsilon prime is 0 if these two equations are true, where prime is derivative with respect to u. Yeah. Now let's try to look at some solutions of these coupled chain model, and we want to interpret these solutions as some microstate solutions of a black hole. So we want them to be static solutions. So to do that, as I said before, if the masses are time independent, the SL2R charges are also time independent since they are proportional to each other. So we want that the masses at each site, these MIs, are time independent. Now recall that these, since this equation is basically linear, we can always split these Hare charges, which are labeled by these box Qs, into two parts. One is a static part, which is locked in with these A-2 charges. And one is a monopole part, which is decoupled from these A-2 charges. So I will elaborate on what I mean by locked in and monopole in what follows. So yeah.
Sorry, just one quick question. You said this MI are time independent. You mean you are just choosing some T of U, some form for T of U, and for which the Schwarzschild is constant?
Yeah. So we want solutions where MIs are time independent if you want to interpret our model as a black hole microstate.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. So we'll choose a T of U, as I said, which leads to MI prime 0. I'll just flash this equation again because I'll keep using it. So yeah, for static solutions, let us look at the equation for MI primes first, which is the first line. So one of the possible ways to make the right-hand side of this equation 0 is to demand that these box Qs, these gravitational Hare, are all parallel to each other. So what we can do is now, since we have a global SL2R, just a single global SL2R, we can do SL2R rotation to make these box Qi primes to be aligned in the 0 direction. So which is the first line. So we set box Qi prime 0 to be some values, and box Qi prime plus and minus components to be equal to 0. Now that implies this dot product will not feature the plus and minus component of these A-2 charges. It will only feature the 0 component of these A-2 charges. Now to set the 0 component of this combination to be 0 for all I, we choose all of the 0 components to be equal, which is this line. So all Qi zeros are the same. So that ensures that MI primes are 0 at every site. So we still have a freedom to choose the plus and minus components of the Qis. So what we're doing is we're choosing them randomly, uniformly. That also implies that we're choosing the masses at each site randomly, because recall that Q dot Q was proportional to the mass. Now this is about the mass equation. Let's look at the gravitational Hare equation, which is this line. So to ensure Qi double prime is 0, what we can do is set these box Qis to be proportional to these lattice Qis, which we do here. So this is what I mean when I said these gravitational Hare are locked in with the A-2 charges. So these are just proportional to these guys. Now, since the equation is linear and second order, we can always add a site independent constant And this term will also satisfy the equation for Qi double prime. Now on top of this, we can have a monopole term. By what I mean by monopole term is defined in this line. So monopole term is something which is site independent. So alpha times u is the boundary time, and it only has a 0 component, and plus and minus components are 0. Since the equations are linear, the total SL2R gravitational hair are basically just a linear combination of Qi locked plus Qi monopole. So now such a static solution is what I will refer to as a microstate solution in what follows. So on top of this static solution, our model can also support some oscillating modes which don't affect this background static solution which I've described. And these oscillating modes are what I call hair oscillations. And I label that by these Qi rad or Qi radiation. Now these modes are such that Qi rad has no components in the plus and minus direction, so they're 0. It only has a 0 component which I label by these small Qi's. Now since all the SL2R hair are, SL2R EDS2 charges are equal in the 0 component, if you look at the 0 component of this equation, this term is 0. So that means the 0 component of the gravitational hair is just decoupled from our EDS2 throats. So which is why I can choose the radiation to the hair oscillations to be purely along the 0 direction. And also I can see that the hair oscillation has to obey this free discrete Klein order. Now the total gravitational hair can therefore be decomposed or written in these three terms. There's one piece which is locked in with the EDS2 throats, one which is a monopole term which is site independent, and there's this oscillating piece which I label by Qi radiation. Now since we've already subtracted a site independent piece in Qi monopole, we want the sum over I Qi primes and sum over I Qi's to be 0. Now I can always do this. This you can see if you study this equation. So if we sum over both sides, sum over I on both sides, you can clearly see that the right hand side will vanish because we have a chain with periodic boundaries. So that implies sum over I Qi double prime is 0. So therefore we can always set sum over I Qi prime to be some constant, and we just choose that constant to be 0 since we've already subtracted a monopole piece. Yeah, so now coming to the choice of lambda, or at least the sign of lambda. So what sign of lambda should we choose for our model to make sense? So we recall this energy equation, the definition of energy for our model, which was this. We choose the masses at each EDS2 site to be positive. So this term is positive definite. Then this term has only the 0 component remaining as I described before. So this is just Qi 0 prime squared. So this is positive, provided lambda is also positive. This term will be positive definite. The only negative contribution can arise from this term. But recall that we're choosing the plus and minus components randomly, uniformly at random. So if we average over each possible initial conditions, we expect that the average of this guy will just vanish. So that implies that if we choose lambda to be positive, our average energy of our model will be positive. So therefore, in what follows, for all the results I will show in the following, I will choose lambda to be positive. Now there are additional constraints on these EDS2 charges, which I won't describe in detail because I'll run out of time. So the constraints come from wanting these tau of u's, which I described before, and their first and second derivatives to be real and continuous. So this constraint enforces some additional bounds on what choices for these SL2R charges I can make. So when I choose Q plus and Q minus randomly, the interval over which I'm choosing Q plus and Q minus is not completely unbounded. There are some constraints given by this reality and continuity conditions. So yeah, it's okay if all of these, if you got lost in all of these details. In what follows, I'll be showing some results and plots which should be easier to follow. So let's try to probe such a static solution by throwing in some matter. So we want to see if our model or such a static solution will behave like a black hole if we throw in one or more compact objects or one or more shocks. So we want the following to be true if our model is to be viable. So once all the shocks have fallen into our E-raised to throats, we want the system to relax to a new static solution or a new microstate solution. But we also allow for these hair oscillations or these decoupled gravitational hair to exist. Now we also want that the energy which is injected because of the shocks, it should go almost completely towards increasing the total mass, and a very small fraction of it should go towards these gravitational hair. And we also want the energies in the E-raised to throats and the energies in the gravitational hair to be independently conserved to a very good approximation. So let's.
Can I just say something quickly that so as you said that this fragmented ADS2 copies and the gravitational hair comes naturally in the near horizon ADS4, extremal ADS4. So when you are asking that whether this model behaves as a black hole to something falling in, can we not see it as a ADS4 black hole having a global SL2R, and there it will behave like a black hole as it should?
Yeah, that's the picture. We want to see if it behaves like a higher dimensional black hole. So the for instance, a two-dimensional lattice would imply that the higher dimensional black hole has a two-dimensional horizon, and so on.
Yeah. So what are the differences here compared to the ADS4 picture that we should investigate this further? Is there any difference here if I start just fragmenting in ADS4 and my initial ADS4 having SL2R near ADS, extremal near ADS2, near horizon ADS2 having SL2R symmetry? In that and the model that you have in hand, is there any difference there that we should ask this question that you are asking right now?
Yeah, so we need to check that after throwing in matter, the final state that we get is actually one of these static solutions. So the final state should actually, we need our model to relax into another black hole microstate.
Okay. So you want to check that there is a thermalization after?
Yeah, exactly.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
That's not guaranteed. So we need to. Yeah.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah. So what do I mean by shocks? So this is defined in this slide. So the first line is an energy momentum tensor in this RU metric which I showed before. So it's easy to check that any energy momentum tensor of this form where Fi is any function of U will be conserved in that background metric. So for shocks, we choose Fi of U's to be proportional to delta functions, where these EIs indicate the size of the shock or the amount of energy you're injecting. And these UIs indicate the time at which the shock is thrown in. So yeah, let's look at what happens when we shock a 5-site chain model. So it's a one-dimensional chain. Everything in the following part of my talk is for a one-dimensional chain with periodic boundary conditions. So we study as an example, a 5-site chain model. So first, the shock is thrown in at U equal to 0, which is this vertical line. So let's look at what happens before U equal to 0. So the total energy given by this yellow curve is conserved. So that's a good thing. The total mass is static, which is also what we want. And the energy in the hair charges are also naturally flat. So what happens after you throw in the shock? The total energy jumps, it increases, which is as expected. The total mass increases. And you can see on this scale, at least, there is no change which happens to the gravitational hair. But if you actually zoom into these two curves, the red and the blue one, there are very tiny oscillations of the order of 10⁻⁻⁴, which will indicate an exchange of energy between these two guys. But these oscillations eventually die down as you go to higher and higher U's. So let's look at the masses now, the individual masses at each of these sites. So again, we start off with static masses, which is what we want for a static initial configuration. After the shock, we're throwing in the shock at site 1, which is this green curve. So you can see that only site 1 jumps instantaneously. The other sites change smoothly. So causality is well respected. And you can see that the mass is finally relaxed to another static configuration. So which is again what we want for our model to be viable. Now this is an interesting plot. This is the plot of the zero component of the e⁻²SL2R charges. So recall that we want the e⁻²SL2R charges in the zero direction to be equal to each other initially for us to have a static configuration. So after the shock, they all scatter around, they deviate, and you can see that they finally equilibrate to the same value. So this is exactly what we want. We want to go from one static microstate or one static solution to another. So for that to happen, we would need such an equilibration to occur. Similarly, I plot the minus components of the e⁻² charges in this side. You can again see that these also relax to a static configuration eventually. Similarly, the plus components also relax to a static configuration as shown in this picture. So it is true that we are going from one static initial configuration to another static initial configuration after one shock. But the pictures I've shown you are just for a single shock. These results hold for 2 or higher shocks as well. Now what I haven't shown you here is the hair oscillations. So the final state that our model settles to is the static configuration with these decoupled gravitational hair oscillations on top. So now that we've studied our model in detail and looked at some solutions, let's see if some information processing properties of our model, what do they look like? Yeah, so we want to look at this whole idea of information mirroring, which I talked about in the introduction. So, sorry, the picture is, the picture is that Alice wants to destroy, let's say, some secret diary she has. So she wants to know that if she throws this secret message or diary into our model black hole, which is this circular lattice here, which is a 5-side lattice. So she wants to know if she throws this secret diary into our lattice, if Bob, who is sitting outside our model black hole, if he can somehow decode the information in her diary somehow. And the answer to that question, it turns out, is yes, but for classical information, as we've established so far. So by classical information, I mean if Alice encodes some message in the positions of the shocks. So let's say she shocks site 1, 2, 3, and so on. So the positions where she's shocking and the time ordering of the shocks. So these two pieces of information is what Bob can easily decode if he just studies these decoupled hair oscillation, which I had indicated by these squiggly blue or violet lines before. So he just feeds this through a decoder and this secret message that Alice threw in pops out. So in this section, I will talk about this decoder in detail for this concrete example of a 5-side chain. So yeah, this slide is just a summary of what I said. So the answer to Alice's question is that Bob just needs to study this Q radiation or these decoupled hair oscillations carefully, and he can obtain this information about the positions and the time ordering of the shocks very easily. Yeah, so this is a schematic of our decoding. So this is just to make an analogy with the Hayden-Preskill circuit diagram. So this is the initial state of our model. So we start with a static solution. We start with a solution where there is no there are no hair oscillations on top. We can always do that because there is a physical mechanism by which the hair oscillations would be carried away, namely Hawking radiation. So we assume that initially there are no hair oscillations of these decoupled hair oscillations on top. We start with a static configuration. We throw in some shocks here. This mixing indicates the dynamics of our model, which mixes up the shocks with the static initial configuration. And it spits out these new decoupled oscillations and these other modes. So Bob then applies this decoding operation on these decoupled oscillations, and he can recover some information about the positions and the time ordering of these shocks. Yeah, so this is a typical plot of the Fourier transform of these Qi primes. Recall that I'm labeling these decoupled gravitational hair oscillations by small Qi's. So what I'm plotting in this figure is just a discrete Fourier transform of the data for Q3 prime, from the data from our numerics. So you can see clearly that there are two main frequency modes. One of them is around 30 and the other is between 18 and 19. So let's see why we have these two modes only and how they come. So recall that these free oscillations, these decoupled Hare oscillations, obey just this free Klein-Gordon equation, discrete Klein-Gordon. You can notice that this is basically, for a 5-side chain model, this is basically a system of coupled harmonic oscillators. So we can just solve this analytically very easily. So we choose sigma to be this small value, 0.01. And we compute the normal mode for this system of 5 coupled harmonic oscillators. And these turn out to be 30.27, 18.71, and 0. Now the first two frequencies are doubly degenerate. So we have 5 frequencies as we would expect. And there would also be the corresponding negative frequency modes. So you can see that these two are reasonably close to what we get from our numerics. So there's a peak around 30 and there's one between, this guy's 18, between 18 and 19.
Tanay, just so that I understand it, in Hayden Presskill or Yoshida Kitaev, they have, so they start with an EPR or a TFT, and of which half of which is from the black hole and half of which is Bob's computer.
Yeah.
So here in your decoder, what is that other half? So you have your own black hole, but what is the decoder's part of the EPR pair that you are using?
So that's what the Hayden Presskill in the paper called early radiation. So as I mentioned before, we can have these additional Hare oscillations on top, which we initially don't start with. So if we start with some decoupled Hare oscillations before shocking, that is what would correspond to these early radiation that Hayden and Presskill talk about. So Bob can have access to this early radiation and this late radiation, and then he can decode.
Yeah, but Lata, probably you're asking something else. It's about.
Yeah, I think, what I'm asking is, or maybe maybe what Tanay said is that, but I don't get it. So in Hayden Presskill, you have, you start with an EPR.
Yeah.
So basically your black hole, so the idea is this, so you let the black hole evaporate up to page time, and then you construct a EPR pair out of the Hawking radiation and the remaining black hole.
Yeah.
So that, I thought that your model is that remaining black hole. So I was asking, where is the other half of the EPR pair, which will be the decoder of Bob's, which will be part of the decoder of Bob, which will be the Bob's computer.
So I think one way to see this is you have you have copied your information twice. It's possible classically, of course. So if you look into this diagram, on the right hand side there are this localized queues and the monopole queues and the ADS2 throat SL2R charges. So the final values of this are determined by what shocks went in, right? In a very complicated way. It's a very, it becomes in a way that you cannot predict. So here there is some randomness. I mean, not real randomness, pseudo randomness, because it's a deterministic system. But at the same time, this information of the shocks are also coming out in the decoupled radiation. So in a way, you could see there are two copies of it. So this mimics the EPR pair, but it's like a classical version of it. It's not really,
Yeah, exactly. So what I'm talking about now is classical information which are encoded in the shocks. But yeah, as I was saying that these queues which are locked in, these gravitational Hare, they, as you recall, they are proportional to these ADS2 SL2R charges. So these encode information about the shocks as well as the initial conditions. So there is information about the shocks in both these decoupled Hare oscillations and also in these guys. But you can't decode from these guys because they are mixed up with the initial conditions.
Okay.
So there are actually two copies, but yeah, you can't, it's not that clear to, it's not that clearly visible in these guys because they're mixed up with the initial conditions.
And in the Hayden Presskill, anyway, the decoder cannot access the interior state of the black hole. So it's a forbidden access this.
So what will be the mixing and decoding for you?
Yeah, so mixing is just the dynamics of our model. So this coupling equations which I showed before with the shock thrown in. And decoding is what I'm coming to now.
Okay.
Yeah. Yeah, so as I was saying, we have these two frequency modes if you look at the Fourier transform of Q primes at each side. I've just shown you an example of Q3 prime, but it's qualitatively the same at each side. Yeah, so to decode, yeah, sorry, let me come back to this figure. So to decode, what Bob needs to do is look at the phase difference between these two frequency modes at each side. So he computes the phase difference, the difference between the phase at this frequency and this frequency modulo 2 pi. So all phases are computed modulo 2 pi in the following. And he plots that versus for each site. And let's see what that tells him. So let's say there's just a single shock which occurred at this site, which I call site 1. And the site which is shocked is colored in blue. The unshocked sites are colored in pink. So the numbers indicated above these bubbles are the phase differences I talked about. So you can clearly see a symmetry pattern emerging. So these two phase differences are approximately equal up to our numerical precision. Similarly, these two frequencies are these two phases are approximately equal. So if Bob just plots these phase differences, he can just easily determine that it was indeed this site which was shocked. Now you might think that this is just some trivial consequence of the symmetry because you're just shocking one side out of 5. So yeah, it should be obvious that this symmetry comes out. But recall that the initial condition we are starting off with is highly asymmetric. We start off with random initial masses and random Q plus Q minuses. Also, so there's no reason that the symmetry would be preserved the symmetry of the shocks would be preserved. And note that the symmetry is only seen in the phases of these Q3 primes or Qi primes. For instance, if you look at these amplitudes and you plot it for the other sides as well, the symmetry pattern is completely destroyed. These amplitudes depend significantly on the initial conditions. So it's only one aspect of these decoupled gravitational hair that remember the information about the shock, namely which position the shock happened at. So that's why the existence of this symmetry is not a very trivial thing. Yeah, similarly, we can study what happens when we shock two sites. Let's say we shock two nearest neighbor sites, which are indicated by these blue guys again. So dark blue indicates that the site was shocked first, and light blue indicates that it was shocked second. So in this case, look at the maxima and the minima of these phase differences. So these two tell you the positions at which the shock occurred. So what is left is to determine the time ordering. To do that, since now Bob knows that it is a nearest neighbor shock based on these extremum values, he identifies the minimum value, and the site corresponding to the minima is the one which was shocked first, and the site corresponding to the maxima is the one which was shocked later. Now we have checked this for multiple different random initial conditions, and this same pattern holds for a single shock or two shocks as well. Now there's only one other possibility for a 5-site chain, which is two shocks which are separated by one site in between, which is given in this figure. So here the dark blue circle is shocked first and the light blue circle is shocked second. Here again, Bob first identifies the extremum values of the phase differences, which are these two guys. Now he knows that the shocks are not nearest neighbor, they are separated by one site. So in this case, his decoding algorithm is the opposite. So the site with the maximum phase difference is shocked first, and the site with the minimum phase difference is shocked later. Again, in this case, this pattern holds for multiple random initial conditions, which I talked about before. So now I've shown you examples of one shock and two shocks. We haven't studied 3, 4, 5, and so on. But one would expect that as we increase the number of shocks we're throwing in, since the amount of parameters that we have is limited, we just have these phase differences between these decoupled hair oscillations at each site. After some number of shocks have gone in, we won't be able to decode information about the shock. So there would be some limit on the amount of shocks that we can decode. Yeah, so this is just this whole discussion about decoding condensed into just one neat series of steps that Bob can follow to do the decoding. So I won't repeat all this. This is just for when the slides are put up online. Yeah, so that completes the algorithm part, or one of the main portion of the main results of our upcoming paper. So now I'll come to the concluding parts of my talk. I'll first talk about some future work or future directions we can go in, and then I'll conclude. So yeah, as I've stressed before, so far we've studied decoding of only classical information. So the classical information which is encoded in the positions of the shocks and the time ordering. So the next obvious step would be to throw in some qubits and check if they are actually remembered or they can be recovered by Bob. So we can imagine these decoupled Hare oscillations, we can think of them as a open quantum system coupled to some e⁻² bath, and then study how this open quantum system evolves and see if Bob can decode some information about Alice's qubits from this system. Another step we can do is to add Hawking radiation to each of our e⁻² throats and see what happens. So we expect that the Hawking quanta would interact with these gravitational Hare oscillations and would also retain this symmetry patterns and these decoding which happens at the level of these Hare oscillations. So we expect that these symmetry patterns would be carried over to the Hawking radiation and Bob would be able to decode from that. So these are two of the most obvious possible directions we need to go in. One more thing we can do is generalize our model to a more network-like picture. So right now the coupling and the interaction between the e⁻² throats is just occurring at the boundaries. So we can imagine coupling these e⁻² throats in the interior. So this is a schematic of how one might do that. So each of these flat lines here labeled by Q1, Q2, and Q3 are these e⁻² throats. And they end at these two geodesics labeled by QB1, QA1, and so on. Yeah, so we can imagine that we have, for example, we have these three e⁻² throats and we glue these geodesics together such that QB1 is equal to QA2 and so on. And then construct a nice network-like picture out of these e⁻² throats. Yeah, I won't elaborate much on what these blue arrows and so on mean. That take too long. Similarly, one can do something on the SYK side as well. So we can construct a MPS type network out of SYK spin states, which were described in this paper by Kurkulu and Marlasena. So the picture for that is analogous to the picture for the e⁻² network, which I showed before. So at each SYK dot, one can imagine we can club these Majorana fermions such that they essentially look like poly spin matrices. And then we have these so-called SYK spin states. And we can imagine that we split these spins at each side into two parts, and then we entangle them to the nearest neighbor SYK dots and construct a MPS type network in this manner. So these such networks would be interesting from the condensed matter point of view as well. And yeah, these have been studied in recent literature from the point of view of seeing how linear in T resistivity appears at arbitrarily low temperatures and so on. So this is also an interesting direction on its own merit, even without the e⁻² idea in mind. So yeah, I've come to the end of my talk. So to conclude, we have constructed a simple lattice model where each lattice point is a e⁻² throat with some gravitational Hare on top. We've shown how the model has some desirable phenomenological features, namely that it relaxes to another static solution after shocking and so on. I've described how it can provide insights into information processing by a black hole. I've described a concrete decoding procedure for some classical information. Yeah, that the decoding procedure mimics this hidden Presqu'île protocol, but again, I reiterate it's for classical information so far. And I've also shown briefly how our model could be generalized to more complicated networks in the future. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, thanks for this talk.
Questions.
And so, yeah, more questions.
Yeah, maybe I can ask one sort of basic question, which is how did you synchronize the various boundary clocks? You have so many ADS2s, and you have, in principle, you should have private boundary clocks like not just one U, but U1, U2, U3, etc.
Yeah.
And if you have just one U, how did you do that?
Yeah. So, yeah, let me go back. Yeah. Yeah. I'm trying to find where our microstate solutions are. Yeah, the constraints on tau. Yeah, here. Yeah. So, yeah. So that's an interesting question. It turns out that the answer is that what the direction of time is kind of emergent in our model. We don't put that in by hand. So recall that initially we are setting some initial conditions on these tau of u's. So the initial condition at each of the sites is set to be the same. So we set tau of u at u equal to 0 to be equal to 0 at each of the sites. So initially the clocks are synchronized, but then the question is, at some of these sites, the tau prime u's might be negative and some other site tau prime u's might be positive. So some sites might be going backward in time, the others might be going forward in time. But it turns out that these constraints which I talked about here, which are imposed because of the continuity of tau and its realness, and also these choices for the SL2R charges that we are making. So all of these imply that the tau primes at each of the sites are positive. So we basically have the same direction of time at each site. And initially we are starting with synchronized clocks for each of the ADS2 throats.
Yeah, but this is not necessary. So after you throw in the shocks, then the final microstate, there is no synchronization. So they are just whatever they are. And in fact, the fact that they go out of synchronization is exactly what captures quantum chaos. And so you could start with actually asynchronous clocks also, and you get the same result. So it's not very important to all this.
So you need to have a lot of gauge fixing to do that, right? I mean, otherwise each of these, I mean, in the sense that maybe all these conditions that you have, that the individual QI fellows are also U independent. Somewhere you have to put in a lot of gauge conditions to say that individual boundary clocks, U1, U2, U3, etc., these parameterizations, you can just make them all describe, you know, you can describe all of them by just one U.
I think, yeah. So,
you know,
so here actually you have one SL2R, not individual SL2R symmetries actually, because there's only one global SL2R, which is kind of preserved in the model. And, but for any given throat, once you say these are the three SL2R charges, and you just say what is the value of tau of u at some u is equal to 0, say, then your tau of u is uniquely fixed, because at least when the Qs are, if the Qs are some constant values, for example, and then this tau of u's are fixed. Then of course, if you shock them, they will evolve accordingly. I mean, given by the model. But you have a one global time, because, so, and then.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, there is maybe there is an overall geometry very clever, which like in, you know, we can take global ADS2 as a sort of prototype example in which there are two sides. Okay, there's a left boundary and there's a right boundary. And then there is, of course, an overall coordinate, you know, going both compact coordinates, one sigma and one t. And you can, even then, of course, you have some TR of u and TL of u, that the two boundary curves can fluctuate independently. And then you have some gauge fixing condition, which would couple them together. And I mean, in the sense that you don't have 3 independent SL2Rs at right, on the right and on the left. And then, I mean, you have to work somewhat. Like in
yeah, and what thing is, it's exactly that we choose this in zero reduction. So comes in. So this is where we have now made, there's only one overall SL2 transformation we can use and here. And this is the gauge fixing.
All right. Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, Gautam.
Any other questions?
So,
Ayan, I can't hear
if
you.
not, thanks for being here. Okay, I'm saying that thanks for being here then. And if there are no more questions, and the next speaker will be Shobhik, who is also in the audience. Okay, so see you in a week then, and have a nice evening.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.